Everyone told men the same lie: sacrifice equals love. But something strange is happening. The men who stop sacrificing aren't miserable. They're calm, focused, free, and that terrifies people who benefited from their silence. Here's the dark psychology most never say out loud. When a man is trained to believe his needs are dangerous, compliance becomes his identity. He gives, he absorbs criticism, he apologizes for existing. And the more he gives, the less he's respected. That's not romance. That's conditioning. I've watched men stay years longer than they should because they were afraid of being alone. Then the relationship ends and something unexpected happens. Their stress drops. Their sleep improves. Their confidence comes back. Not because they hate women, but because the constant emotional pressure disappears. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What if the relationship wasn't saving him from loneliness, but causing it? And that changes everything forever. Here's the twist no one warned them about. Loneliness doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being erased while someone else takes up all the space. That's the psychological trap. In dark psychology, there's a concept called emotional displacement. One person offloads their stress, dissatisfaction, and insecurity onto another. Over time, the receiver becomes the container for everything negative. Many men slowly realize they're not partners anymore. They're pressure valves. They start censoring themselves, not saying what they want, not doing what they enjoy, not feeling what they feel. Because every emotion becomes a problem, and the brain adapts. It goes numb. Survival mode kicks in. Then the relationship ends, or the man walks away, and the nervous system finally relaxes. Silence feels safer than conversation. Solitude feels warmer than criticism. Peace feels addictive. That's when people get confused. Why isn't he trying to date again? Because his brain remembers the cost. And once your mind links relationships with danger, it doesn't unlearn that easily. Here's where the surprise turns into panic. The moment men discover peace, they stop negotiating with chaos. And from a dark psychology perspective, that's a power shift. See, many dynamics rely on intermittent reinforcement. Praise mixed with criticism, affection followed by withdrawal, approval dangled then revoked. It keeps people chasing. Casinos use it for a reason. So do unhealthy relationships. But solitude breaks the spell. There's no hot and cold, no emotional roulette, just consistency. And the human brain prefers predictability over drama, even if drama feels familiar. That's why some women are stunned. The old leverage doesn't work anymore. Guilt doesn't work. Shame doesn't work. Fear doesn't work. The man isn't reacting. He's not angry. That's the scariest part. He's indifferent. And indifference is what happens when someone finally realizes they don't need to earn peace. They can just choose it. Once a man experiences that level of calm, the real question becomes dangerous for relationships everywhere. Why would he give it up? Here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. When a man stays single and becomes happier, it exposes a psychological imbalance that was always there. Control only feels normal to those who benefit from it. In dark psychology, there's a principle called loss of influence. When someone realizes they no longer need approval, validation loses its power. Attention loses its leverage. Emotional reactions stop being currency. That's why some responses turn hostile. Labels appear: emotionally unavailable, intimidated, avoidant. These aren't diagnoses, they're coping mechanisms. When influence disappears, narratives replace it. The man, meanwhile, is changing quietly. He's rebuilding routines. His hobbies return. His money stays where he earns it. His nervous system stabilizes. He's not performing anymore. And here's the cliff edge. When a man stops needing a relationship to feel whole, relationships must compete with peace. And most don't measure up. So the real fear isn't that men are alone. It's that they're no longer controllable. This is where the psychology gets even darker. Many relationships were never built on love. They were built on leverage, resources, attention, emotional labor, compliance, and when a man exits, the system collapses. There's a concept called covert contracts. Unspoken agreements like, if I tolerate this, I'll be loved, or if I provide enough, I'll be appreciated. The problem, the reward never comes. The contract only benefits one side. When men stay single, those contracts expire. No more emotional tax. No more unspoken obligations. No more being punished for having preferences. That's why the shock is so visible, because the man didn't just leave a relationship. He exited a role he was never allowed to renegotiate. And now he's smiling, sleeping better, saying no without guilt. Here's the real tension. If more men realize happiness doesn't require partnership, what happens to relationships that depend on silent sacrifice to survive? Now we reach the part no one wants to admit. When men leave and thrive, it forces an identity crisis. Not for men, but for the system that assumed they'd always come back. Dark psychology calls this expectation collapse. When someone believes another person has no alternatives, they behave differently. Demands increase, respect decreases, effort drops. Why try when escape isn't possible? But suddenly, escape is chosen, and not in desperation, in relief. That's why you hear the same phrases repeated. He'll regret it. He's afraid of commitment. He'll be lonely. These aren't predictions. They're self-soothing scripts, because the evidence says otherwise. Men aren't spiraling. They're stabilizing. They're healthier, more focused, more grounded. And once people see that independence doesn't equal misery, the illusion cracks. Here's the dangerous realization forming. If men can be fulfilled without relationships, then relationships must offer more than access, demands, and pressure. And many aren't ready for that competition. Here's where the fear turns into resistance. When men stop chasing, the dating market doesn't just shift, it destabilizes. Dark psychology explains this through supply shock. When something once abundant becomes scarce, its perceived value spikes. Male attention used to be unlimited, always available, always trying, always proving. Now it's selective, conditional, withdrawn, and that changes behavior fast. Some respond by escalating demands, louder standards, higher requirements, more pressure. But that backfires, because men who've tasted peace don't negotiate with ultimatums. Others try guilt. Real men commit. Good. Men don't run, but guilt only works on people who doubt themselves. And these men don't anymore. They've done the math. Peace plus freedom beats approval plus stress. And here's the cliffhanger. Once men stop competing for relationships, relationships must compete for men. That reversal has consequences no one is ready to face yet. Now comes the most revealing phase. When men withdraw emotionally and still thrive, it exposes a truth that was hidden by noise. Desire cannot be coerced. Commitment cannot be demanded. An attraction cannot survive resentment. Dark psychology calls this reactance. The moment people feel controlled, they instinctively resist. Many men didn't leave because they hated relationships. They left because they felt trapped inside them. When single, something flips. Their time feels like it belongs to them again. Their energy isn't monitored. Their choices aren't interrogated, and that autonomy becomes addictive. Here's the shocker. When these men are later approached, they don't feel excited. They feel cautious, because peace taught them discernment. They don't ask, does she want me? They ask, does this cost my calm? And that question filters out most options instantly, which leads to the final tension. If peace becomes the baseline, only something truly valuable can replace it. This is where the narrative completely flips. Men aren't opting out because they failed. They're opting out because they learned. And learning permanently changes behavior. In dark psychology, there's something called pattern recognition trauma. Once the brain connects emotional effort with punishment, it refuses to repeat the experiment. No motivation speech can override that. That's why these men don't argue online. Don't complain. Don't try to convince anyone. Silence is their boundary. Distance is their self-respect. They're building quietly. Careers without interference. Bodies without sabotage. Friendships without jealousy. Homes without tension. Lives without audits. And here's the part that stings. Some women eventually notice the absence, not just of men, but of effort, protection, generosity, and presence. And they ask, where did all the good men go? But the men never disappeared. They just stopped volunteering for environments that punish them for existing. And that leads us to the final realization. Here's the final truth, and it's uncomfortable. Men didn't choose isolation. They chose alignment with their nervous system, their values, their self-respect. Dark psychology teaches that the strongest position isn't dominance, it's non-dependence. When a man no longer needs validation, approval loses power. When he no longer fears being alone, manipulation collapses. That's why this shift feels shocking. It wasn't rebellion, it was awakening. Men discovered they were lonelier in relationships where they couldn't be themselves than in solitude. Where they could breathe, they learned that peace is not empty. It's fertile. It creates growth, clarity, and strength. And now the bar is higher. Relationships must add to life, not drain it. Love must coexist with respect. Partnership must compete with peace. That's the twist no one expected. Men didn't walk away angry. They walked away healed. And once you experience that, you never trade it lightly.